is that it doesn't necessarily pivot off, you know, all the forms of physicality, hearing, sight, and all these other physical forms. Just a thought.
I am really sorry about the bad connection here. I don't even know if you can hear me at this point. I restarted everything.
That sounded great, but then, yeah, uh, hopefully it will continue to be.
I want to pick up on what Mark just said a little bit, and maybe see if I can pack in my initial reactions to the document that Frode sent that we started talking about. I think for me at the like at a fundamental level, I think there's just a lot of confusion and a lot of work still to be done in almost all disciplines in establishing with discipline specific methodologies and vocabulary what exactly is the relationship of the human being to space in our everyday physical reality. I think we're all suffering from, and by all I mean just like all the disciplines like architecture, computer science, all of them are suffering a little bit from this like what is water kind of thing, like that cartoon with the fish. um, we're just taking the fact that we are creatures that move through space a little bit for granted. And there's a little bit of work that's starting to be done in actually mm, putting, trying to put words and concepts and meat in positing a relationship between the extent to which, like, what does this mean, right? That we're like, we can't escape space. Um, we can't not be in space. And this has very deep implications for every single discovered that there is no environment because the lines we draw between us and the environment are artificial. So, um, and that was the work that like which was against apparently what cybernetics was doing, which was building up computer science based on the fact that there's a well-defined border between organism and environment, and messages are being exchanged through like input-output theory and all of that. So we can spend forever discussing embodied cognition, cybernetics, and how all that started in the 50s and 60s. So that I'm mentioning this as like a little attempt within certain disciplines to posit this relationship between the organism and space in a way that starts to be productive, right? And in cybernetics, it was very productive, and it started with biology. I believe all disciplines need to do this, and it has to start or take into account biology and posit, like positioning yourself but because this work like lagging behind so severely in this work in all disciplines, we are carrying over these severe lacks of understanding and theoretizing into these virtual worlds and into our discussions and ability to understand these virtual worlds. For example, one of my issues or difficulties reading and trying to place myself with respect to what the content of the PDF is that it seems like, or to propose anything even close to what's in this PDF, it seems like there there has to be some assumptions about the relationship between what we call human thinking and human knowledge and space.
I can still hear you, and I just want to say thank you for that. And also,
Assumptions
Carl,
in
for
this
this,
PDF. So this PDF thing,
I think you can just go on.
okay, sorry, I'll wrap it up. Maybe that was the cue for me that I'm speaking for too long. Yeah, so I feel like these assumptions that there is something called knowledge, and this has some relationship to space. The foundation for that has to be more well defined for us to be building on stable ground. And there is some work that's being done right now, which is interesting, hypothesizing the relationship between space and the fact that as human beings, we cannot connect to space of the space of what does that mean? And the number I just want to mention as an example of what I'm trying to say, you're familiar with what everyone is familiar with. There's like tons of opinions for and against it. But for me, it's just the most common example that I give to help people understand what I'm talking about. And the first serious attempt that became popularized to try to posit any kind of relationship between space as a physical reality and experience and the space of the mind and the space of knowledge. Okay, so that's kind of my 2 cents, that we need to get real about what kind of assumptions or lack of assumptions we are building on top of.
So I would usually wait for Fro to let me speak, but here he can't even interrupt me, so I'll take it. Maybe another way to say some of what you said, Andrea, to me is the tension between like the excitement just free to get school without even anything to hang it on. In our usual daily life world in 3D in space and getting good at it without even noticing, and how we can piggyback on that, hijack this extremely powerful brain with those ability for that context versus leaving that space. Because again, like if I sculpt in VR, I can sculpt in here, literally. I don't have to have it hang on the wall, on the table, etc. I can change gravity. Like if I drop it, it can fall or not. We can fall extremely slowly. We can change scales. I can be extremely small because I blow up the world around me. I can be extremely big. I can teleport, which definitely cannot do in the normal world. And I can teleport while rotating the world around me. So to me, it's like this tension between we're so good at hijacking our brain's capability to handle space and the body with it, not just the brain, I mean. And yet, if we just stick to it, it's such a shame. Like we can do so much more. So it's kind of this difficulty I have, and because as per usual, and I think most of us, yeah, I just tend to reproduce what I'm used to do because I'm kind of good or efficient at it. And yet again, if we stick to this, if we stick to just like mesospace and gravity, Earth-based gravity, not teleporting, Euclidean space, it's kind of also a waste of a medium. Like it's like reproducing your house in VR. It's fun, but okay, once you've done it, you need something else.
Brandel, haha, I got to say something.
Excellent. Um, so I agree. I'm a strong adherent of to ideas like neuroplasticity, but I also think that to spare a thought of for the journey from here to there is an important one. That making sure that we don't understate the extent to which we are, to Andrea's point, used to living in our bodies and with our eyes and with our hands, the distance they are. I was watching, Andrea, your most recent video of sort of sketching an architectural space, and I was just really reminded how different heights we are, and how the default character figures were not at the height that I would have expected from me because I am 6'1", and um and that yeah, that those are very important sort of implicit things. With a VR headset a while ago, my daughter was using my Vision Pro and casting her headset height, so she could walk around the house and see it from the height that she is, and perfectly natural to her and very funny for me, and vice versa. So I walked around and showed her what it's like to be me. And it was still not, entirely what it's like to be me because I'm obviously much older and more brittle. But yeah, like the reality of how well understood at a sort of a visceral level, the sort of the spatial modalities that we have to build on, as well as so another thing that happened this past week, talking to Meta and other these other folks about what the practical consequences of adding a portal to HTML entail. And it also reminded me that unless we have a robust, not just common metaphor, because we mostly, I think, do for space, but a common modality for discussing that common metaphor, then anything that can go wrong between two people's shared understanding of what being in the world entails will go wrong. So we had a 35-minute discussion where we were violently agreeing with each other about the practical consequences of having an object appear as though it's in front of something, although the depth of it looks as though it's behind it, and the kind of stereo conflicts that arise from that. Everybody agreed it's disgusting, but people couldn't agree on whether that meant that the portal was transparent or not. And yeah, time and time again, we we know what we know. We know what we talk about, but if we don't talk about that aspect of what we know, then we are nowhere. So yes.
Yeah, it is nice and fun to tell people to go next, but it's kind of in order anyway. So please go, Carl, and then Andrea. Please.
I'll mention briefly some of the stuff that Fabian was talking about is that anyone who's done even a cursory glance through a game engine or tried to develop something in 3D, it 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 really dawns on you rather quickly the amount of control over that environment you have and the amount of constraints that you no longer have to follow, which is interesting. So, like he mentioned, I can turn off the gravity, or I can invert it, or I can make it go left to right. So, physics, you can throw away physics, you can overwrite physics however you want. Space and obeying laws of thermodynamics, conservation of matter. You can create things out of nothing, you can delete them, you can move them. So, there's no issue for speed limitations, there's no issue of um, materials or object to object interaction because you get to explicitly state what all of those things do and how they behave. And this isn't something that's new to VR because all of these tools and ability to do these things have existed in games, particularly 3D games, for a long time. And we see that traditional game devs do understand a lot of this. But to sort of kind of curb the really exciting, really like run away with the ball kind of enthusiasm that Andrea sometimes gets for things like this is, and I think Brandel mentioned this as well, is that you have to keep some things grounded and some things familiar. Because if you change everything and people have no expectations or no clue what anything's going to do when they interact with it, and they're not able to quickly or succinctly build up an understanding of how those systems work, people get lost or they disengage. And you see this in creative writing as well, particularly or players tend to just not engage with that system because they can't plan around it. And so you have to balance sort of visual and physical affordances in your game or in your environment with whatever the new or weird thing is that you've introduced. And a lot of games simplify this down and have really become formulaic. And they say there's one weird thing or there's one new thing, and that's called the core mechanic for the game. And that is basically what sets your game apart from everything else that's in the same genre or in the same sort of camera perspective.
Yeah, Andrea, please. And thank you, Carl.
I want to just quickly also look back to something Fabian said in relationship to what I said earlier. Um, I think these core observations about the differences between our experience in physical reality and the affordances of virtual space are really at the heart of everything for me. So he mentioned there's no gravity, so maybe objects will fall in a different way or whatever. You can do whatever you want in this like really in ways that like we all know VR experiences that try to mimic physical space as much as possible and those affordances. But like Carl mentioned, if you've ever opened a game engine yourself, you know that you can very easily, rather than go towards mimicking physical space, you could go the other way and really emphasize how different it is. And for me, my entire work is just interested in that, not in our ability to mimic physical space. That's a problem in itself, it's just not my problem. But in that context, again, for me, the statement that I shamelessly make again and again, and that I stand by, is that type of gravity, objects that fall in a different way, that will actually lead towards a different type of thinking and a different type of experience. And this is also kind of unstable territory as well, because I should be defining what I mean by thinking, but I'm gonna, we don't have time for that. But it's just very important to just to clarify what I think, what the hypothesis is and how high the stakes are from the point of view of like my thinking and my work. I absolutely believe that if you have people spend time in these spaces that have no gravity, where objects fall in different ways, and they engage in what human beings normally engage in, which is activity and thinking and so on, some very radical shifts might happen. The second thing I want to mention very, very quickly that's important for me to mention, back to the PDF that we were sent, which I think it's a fantastic place to kind of keep anchoring this discussion into. On the first page, there's this list of verbs that are meant to define or try to tackle the purposes of these knowledge spaces. So the verbs are to find, to learn, to think, to present, to store, and so on. And I'm not sure, but I think they're meant to represent some kind of, they're meant to be descriptions maybe of what we call this mysterious thinking process. And I want to point out that these things are true, but as the pure experience of thinking has none of those things. But we need to use language and abstraction to help us talk about thinking. But that's not what thinking is. So I just want to say that we need to make sure that we're not building systems based on a confusion between the abstraction that we need to communicate about a process and the actual process. So again, when we are thinking, we are not doing any of those verbs. Those are just a level of description of the process called thinking at a certain level of abstraction within human language. It's not what thinking is. Okay, and third thing, very, very quickly, I also have a tiny group that sometimes talks about these things. And on Wednesday, we're going to do a workshop that's called Towards a Notation for Spatial Experience. And we're going to look at John Cage. So we're going to look at the way John Cage was experimenting with notation for music, and also at language, syntax, and text, and see if we can build a new type of notation for what I call spatial experience. So if any of you are interested in that, I'm going to drop the link to that meeting in the chat. Okay, over. Thank you.
That was a lot, and thank you. Please type in the text if you suddenly lose me so I don't waffle on. When it refers to the purposes of knowledge spaces, I agree with you, that is not thinking. The only reason I put that list together, and it's by no means pretending to be authoritative or anything like that, was purely that, particularly in our community, what Andrew has built, what Fabienne has built, what I'm building in 2D predominantly, for the information to go between the spaces, there needs to be a point, there needs to be a purpose. It's very easy to send A, B, C connected this way between different spaces, but why? Right? And I was inspired by, and as Mark pointed out, maybe a bit too inspired by, the 7 hypertexts. The 7 hypertext paper that Mark and Dave Millard wrote had one really important thing for me, and I hope it's important to you too. It pointed out that there is a difference between hypertext for thinking and hypertext for presenting and communicating. That helped me finish my thesis because I was putting things together that weren't the same for a long time. So what I'm talking about with this type of a list is if we're going to build stuff that can talk to each other, Peter often talks about mind palaces, which is really important. That is very, very different from a thinking space in the sense of seeing connections. It is more a storing and finding. So it is a matter of trying to ground the discussion of, why the heck are we building things and what are we sharing? Because it's easy to get into all kinds of spaces mentally, so to speak, while talking about this. So to take a little poll of 2 things in the community. One, as I asked a bit further up, and I think I've lost it here in my internet issue. If you guys would like to continue this conversation next week or the week after or something, we can do that. This internet connection doesn't often go down, right, guys? Mark, back me up on this. Okay, thank you. It is very embarrassing today. That would be
No,
great.
I would say yes. I feel very sorry for Frey because on a day when so many people have turned up here the first time in a while, the fact that your internet should be so flaky is bad luck.
It's the universe, right? And in the discussion here, there's so many places we can go. And I'm not saying we should strictly stick to text, not at all. But it's really worthwhile, I hope, if we confine the discussion to knowledge spaces or spaces with knowledge in them. Because otherwise we can, and of course we can learn from gaming and other things. And Fabienne has something more interesting to say, I am sure. So I will freeze.
No, it's it's to also bounce back on a couple of the remarks, and one about kind of to summarize onboarding. Yes, I don't think somebody who is just discovering VR should be literally upside down and with even gravity changing per motion or something like crazy like that. I think that's probably the best way to get somebody out as app. I think it should be gradual and it should be optional. Like if somebody does not want this, does not want to explore in strange way, because by definition it's going to be different than the usual meso world and not, don't throw them there in the deep end. But I think for people who want to, and it's an argument I do in this group quite often, I mean, it has to be, it's what's the point if it's just to reproduce? I don't think it's enough, but it's only indeed for people who want to, and after some kind of onboarding or discovery, and also according to the limits of the hardware, both technical hardware and what the person also can do. And then that thing is why I insist a little bit is it opens up, and I'm also not going to give a definition of what thinking is today. But if it's generally linked to, if the way we do move in space is generally linked to the way we also think, if we move differently because we have other affordances or way to interact with the world, even though virtual, but still perceived as real to some extent, it should change the way we think. And if it's strange, because by definition it will be new ways, it will lead to strange way to think. And I have a little quote on my desktop from Ken Perlin, which says, "When technology shifts reality, will we know the world has changed?" So I'm going to repeat a bit slowly. When technology shifts reality, will we know the world has changed? And I'll put it in the chat because I think it's deep. I think it's interesting. And I don't know if my world has changed since I'm using VR. It definitely has, but I don't know if it has changed in a meaningful way, like literally the way I think. I don't know if I can know or if someone else can know. So my point is, if we do indeed find new way to move and explore in XR and change the way we think, it's probably a one-way street. Like we probably can't really go back. I don't know how, if it's permanent or not, or this kind of thing. But it is indeed something we can't be too naive about. Like it's going to change us. Again, I don't know to which extent, but I think it's interesting, and it's not necessarily something very noticeable. Like I don't know how good all of you are in terms of introspection, but it's challenging. It's I think it remains challenging with and without tools. It's something tricky. So
I have to briefly, if you don't mind, Mark, add something on what Fabian just said because of Doug Engelbart. So some of you probably know that Moore's law should actually be called Engelbart's law because he quite literally gave that to Gordon Moore based on his research in wind tunnels and so on. He was working for NASA at the time. And that's when he saw that transistors were going to go down. He decided to do all these fun things. And the reason it's relevant, Fabian and everyone, is that Doug said that if you're in a room with no windows and suddenly everything gets 10 times bigger in the X, Y, Z dimension, would you notice? And he said, yes, you would, because you would die. Because weight increases in 3 dimensions, strength increases in 2 dimensions. So your ribs would literally get crushed. So I think that is relevant here, Fabian, because Ken's quote is brilliant. But if we look at the other dimensions that may not scale along with the technological dimensions, we might see some kind of a bifurcation or a fracture there. So thank you. And then Mark and Ken.
Sorry. Yeah, very quickly, and this is partly to check. I've sort of really internalized Andrea's point about sort of thinking in a different environment correctly, because looping back to the idea that, okay, well, if I can construct a game space, an XR space, I can do things like turn off the gravity. But at that point, most of us are thinking, aha, right, I'm now in a place where gravity is not working as I'd expect. and which is different to what you're suggesting, which is no, let's actually step across the threshold and just accept that there is no gravity. So, what else is there? Um, which I think is an interesting provocation, and I think remarkably hard for most of us. So I don't know how one gets started in that, which isn't an argument against doing it, but I think it's an interesting thought as to how we get ourselves into that alternate reality. Thanks.
Can I add something really quickly? I promise
Yeah.
it's just
Yeah.
one sentence. So, Mark, you don't have a choice. I mean, you think you have a choice by saying no and shutting off the headset, but the truth is, you don't really have a choice. Like, when it comes to things like space and time and these like really pernicious things that permeate everything about us, um, it's it it's kind of insane because and that's why I love this technology in particular. You can feel how it's changing you. It's crazy. Like you can watch your brain being like it goes like this. First, you feel uncomfortable. You're like, like your brain is kind of like feels this tension, is trying to process. You can think about it in terms of predictive coding and this like theory. A lot of people are using that. I'm not really on board with, but it has some explanatory value. So you can feel your brain trying to predict and it's not really working. So it's uncomfortable. It's like almost like a pressure in your temples. But then very, very quickly, it's crazy how fast. And the only way to really believe, you don't have to believe me, you just have to go for it. Within like 30 to 2 hours, it's like stuff are like, stuff are changing in your head in a spectacular way. So you don't have to understand it. You don't have to choose it. You don't have to want it. You just have to stick in there for like 30 minutes. Um, and things will happen.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Thank you for that. No, no, Ken, I was just going to say, go ahead. I'm sorry.
yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, it's not directly related, but I was thinking about this debate between how virtual, how beyond physics should VR be versus how real should be designed. And there seems to be like, people in both areas. And of course, we need research in all types. But I think what what I found really interesting is to look at the intersection. So try to design something that feels highly intuitive, as if it is from the real world, like things like hand gestures and all these things that you can integrate. But there's like just a small difference that makes it somehow feel supernatural or something like that. So that initially you know exactly what it is, you're familiar with it, but then you realize it's actually something that is not actually normally possible in the real world. So just to give you an example, this might sound a bit cryptic here, but I looked a lot into new interaction mechanisms, and one thing is these using the eye tracking and hand gestures. Um, so when I did a lot of research into this, my idea was that can we get something that is not as complicated as controllers? Obviously, you can have controllers, you have the buttons, and you have to learn how to use it. And and at the same time, it has more spatial abilities, like that you can interact with anything that is out of your reach. So this is kind of the my motivation why I was looking into eye tracking and this concept of you look at something and then you do these pinch gestures, and this is all and this is actually all also inspired by a paper from Mark Mine. He had a paper in 1995 about virtual environment interaction techniques. So he was from the University of North Carolina. And just to cite one sentence that I also cited in my paper, but we must identify natural forms of interaction and extend them in ways not possible in the real world. So that's where I think it's kind of the interesting part is to mix up what you know, what is familiar with something that is beyond the physics. And yeah, that was just my comment on this part. I will also put down the link here if anyone's interested.
Thank you. And as I see, Carl is asking Ken where he can find out more about your work. I think you put in a link earlier. If you don't mind, Ken, could you please put it in again? Now,
Yeah,
what?
yeah.
Thank you. What I do with these meetings, I put them into the YouTubes, and then I do an automatic kind of a transcription to text, try to assign all the right people speaking the right things, and then I run it through Claude for summary, which I can then share with you guys. But one of the prompts in Claude is to list all the URLs in the chat, which is something Peter suggested a long time ago. So that will be available relatively easily from this meeting. So I have a question for everyone, or Ken, your hand is up. Do you have something further? Okay.
No. Yeah.
So I'm wondering about knowledge in this environment specifically, because so far it's been mostly discussing us in the environment, which is of course crucial. But if we look at the knowledge, what would the shape of the knowledge be? Something we've kind of discussed, but I would love to hear more from you guys how you envision that, how we will be in the knowledge, etc. Easy for me to waffle on, so if someone please put up a yellow hand. Or Ken, you already have your hand. Does that mean you're ready? Okay, we'll go to Brandel then.
So what I want is the ability to attach my mechanical motion to Carl's point to linear systems of feedback that give me the ability to modulate it in multidimensional ways. So one of the things that uh, I was really taken by when I was in high school, my uh, girlfriend's father had one eye. And so I talked to him a bunch about what he did to make sense of the world. And he didn't do it to the level that I sort of noticed it, but apparently he moved his head a lot more in order to be able to get a greater capacity for being able to use his monoscopic head tract parallax as an indicator of depth, and likely had a greater accommodative sensitivity such that he was able to have some better intuition about where he was focusing his one remaining eye in order to make sense of the space that he was in. And yeah, those really just absolutely tight feedback loops of action and response, I believe, are absolutely essential for being able to compose a view of what it is that you're thinking about, uh, and to be able to hone in on exactly which aspect of it that you're looking at. I recently finished reading Cybernetics um, by Wiener, and it was remarkable to hear about the way that we have what at the time, this is 1948, so a long time ago in terms of any scientific sort of understanding of things. But one of the things that he said about eyes, human eyes, and the human visual system is that we at that time thought versus what's happening out wider. Um, and I think so that means that we need to be constantly orienting ourselves. But the muscles are really good at doing that to make sure that that capacity can be leveraged as quickly and as accurately and as flexibly as possible. And it's those kinds of specificities that make me want to make sure that all of the like the most important part is the feedback, the capacity to be able to change your view and update it, and basically nothing in the digital world is as responsive as our capacity to bob our head around and to be able to feel the results. But when we do, when we can get as rich a channel of feedback from as subtle emotion as that, then we will begin to realize just how impoverished our computing systems have been so far, because we we get so much from something that happens with so little so quickly. Um, yeah, hopefully that makes sense in context.
Thank you, Brundle. Carl?
I was going to briefly touch back on the question you posed, which is what does information look like in this sort of hypothetical space that we're talking about? And I think both psychology and art can give us some direction along those lines. It matters a lot what you want the information to do, how diverse it is, and how the overall velocity of that data, like how much data is coming in and out, how much data acquisition via a mapping. So some of us probably understand that if something has a unique color or a unique shape or is in a unique location, it's easier to remember not only where that thing is, but what it does. So you can sort of encode information onto that object based on what it looks like, what it sounds like, where it is, sort of these sensory cues. And given enough similarity or enough novelty between different objects in that mapping, you can use that to encode and remember that information and commit it to long-term memory easier.
That absolutely makes sense. Mark?
Yeah, I was just quickly going to draw together a couple of threads. One of which I sort of alluded to in the sidebar in mentioning collaboration, not because I was critiquing the list, but one thing I think we often make a mistake of is we use collaboration as a portmanteau for all sorts of co-words, co-presence, co-creation, all quite different things, which rather alludes to the point Carl was making earlier about, well, we go to someone maybe to look at something or to be with someone. Collaboration, I think, wins out in the biz stakes because it sounds like money. But actually, the trouble is it actually confuses what we talk about. So if we, for instance, the thing I've learned from years of writing documentation is this is all for naught if the person you're writing for doesn't understand it. It doesn't matter whether you understand it in your own terminology. If they don't understand what you're writing, you're wasting your time. And so, in that sense, when we're constructing things, we're constructing knowledge. I think it behoves us to keep a sharp eye on what we're doing it for, which links back to the point about we tend to conflate something we construct for ourselves, our own personal memory palace, as opposed to something we might create for others. So the mess we create for ourselves is almost instantly understandable because we made it. We put that thing there for no good reason, but it's there, and as long as it's there, we know what it means. We don't have to explain it. It doesn't have to have any meaning. Whereas if we're doing it for somebody else, there is more of a necessity to have some sort of a guidance, as has sort of been alluded to already. Because if you start playing too fast and loose and everything makes no sense at all, then essentially the players or the people in reality just disengage. Thanks.
People in reality. I've never met anyone in reality, least of all you guys. Andrea?
I want to add quickly something about what Brandel said about like when you're talking about how you see that you only get information from a small area of your pupil. Actually, so there was, that famous article about the frog that was widely discussed during the Macy conferences. And Varela went on to actually study the vision system for decades. And the conclusion of his work with vision, starting from the frog and cybernetics and in that whole context, was that only so of the entirety of the information that hits our retina and goes to the brain through the through the optic nerve, 80% is not directly included in our conscious experience of what we're seeing. And today, the consensus is that we're looking at around 95% of the information that comes through the retina, goes through the optic nerve. Like about 5% is actually included. 95% is not just this, it's not like discarded, but it's kind of like cooked and baked and warped around by the brain. So we are hallucinating. At least 95% of what we're seeing is like a hallucination. But from a certain kind of discipline. So you can clearly hear, like Carl did state that what he was going to say comes from, like, we can use psychology and a few other things. So people like Carl are typically good at kind of stating where, like, what's the disciplinary lens of what they're saying. And I really appreciate that. But there's still like a general feel for me that we are in these so-called knowledge spaces, we are doing things. Like we know things and then we decide to do something with the things that we know. And the things I'm struggling with is that I'm not sure what you all mean by knowing things. I'm not sure. I've so let's say I know something. I know the coffee in this cup is cold. And I know a lot of other things. What exactly do I know? And then the other thing is like, I decide to drink some more coffee. I decide to go here and there. There's a lot of assumptions about what we mean by those things. For me personally, my work builds upon embodied cognition and this idea that everything is in the environment. All the information resides in the environment, and our organism is part of that environment. So there isn't really a person that decides what to do or that knows things. It's all part of a system based on the environment of which we're a part of. And this idea, this way of talking through language that I do this, I'm going to save that in my memory, I'm going to take this from here to there, it's another level of abstraction. It's another way we are talking about what's actually happening in the system.
Well, that was wonderful. Oh, no, you're not finished. It's frozen again.
By a certain way of talking about what's going on, which is this first person, I'm doing this and that. And I want to gently suggest that maybe there are other ways backed up by other types of terminology from cognitive science and that other disciplines are working on building right now that might be slightly more productive in this context.
Okay, you are not frozen, so I think I can speak. I didn't want to interrupt you again. I may have missed one or two words there, so if I say something silly, please just raise your hand and tell me. But in the tradition of Doug Engelbart and others, part of how we deal with the fact that everything is compressed visually going through into our brain is the notion of symbols. Doug talked about symbol manipulation, of course. I use the term text because it's a bit more normal in a way. And also Tor Nuvatranders and the user illusion talks about how that kind of compression happens. I think that maybe the notions of glossary and annotations can be very, very helpful here. When I say glossary, I mean a local definition. And when I say annotation, I just mean some imprint on others' work. And in the print world, these have very constrained meanings. But I'm wondering if we work on glossary connections a little bit, that might be helpful. And then a big hi to Ken. And would you like to say hello? Is she running away or does she want to say hello?
Hallo.
Nein. Nein.
Hello.
Yeah, she says hello, kind of.
Ja, to
What language was she speaking? Sorry. I'm looking at Carl's question. You mean like how you can replace characters and hypertext links to whatever words you want, but the link still points to the same thing. I don't really believe in the notion of truth. I think truth is a very lazy concept. Not that you are referring to that, Carl, but the notion of pointing to the same thing. This is where the philosophy around spatial hypertext comes into it, because something that's kind of close to something is important. Also relates to what Peter was saying in the introduction, that we may have a citation for something, but not really, so we put it in the same mental area. So, Carl, you're saying sort of refine the look, feel of a widget. Well, I'm not even sure if that's the thing. Like, what's come up a few times, and what Andrea's really been harping on about in the best possible way, is two people can look at the same thing and say, oh my God, that's beautiful. But one person's looking at the sunset, the other one is looking at the classic car in front of it. Right? It's a very basic thing, and it happens a lot. It also happens with utility. So that's why I'm hoping we can start refining language, something we do a bit in this community, especially with the notion of glossary, because I think glossaries can be incredibly important. I could even imagine LLM-based personal glossaries where we allow an LLM to go through our own papers. So when someone else reads our papers and we've had certain amount of control, they can access that. There are so many ways to deal with it, but what I really dislike about academic papers is their very constrained presentation and their extreme lack of context. You have citations and that's about it. We need to find ways to add further context, because
Place to lose him.
one of the what was that? I didn't hear that.
We lost you well, I lost your audio just at that they're very constrained.
Oh, right. Yeah, well, that was perfect, good timing. They're very constrained in context. And we've lost Andrea as well. Oh, and she needed to run. Yeah, that's fine. She stayed longer than she said she would. We will continue. Right. Anyway, that was a lot of waffle on that. But the point I think we're all working on here is communication has an intent from someone making a statement. And then there's an interpretation by someone. An intent can be the explicit message. It can be an implicit message. It can be a subtext. It can be sarcastic. There are all these things it can be. And when you choose to interpret this message, you have to decide what levels you want to take into account for that interpretation. And this becomes very interesting. And how can spatialized knowledge help or hinder this? Right? An easy way to have our discussion is literally nodes in space with lines in between them. That's kind of the obvious place to start. But in and of itself, that doesn't mean anything. And that's why we looked at the different meanings, different purposes. You're saying here, talking, Carl, in the chat about translation interpretation. Yes, I noticed that Ken's, that was your daughter, Ken, I assume, right? That she was not speaking English, right? And David Bellos, who contributed to our first, to our first book, and who is presented at the Future of Text, he's written a book called "Is That a Fish in Your Ear?" about translation, where he makes the point that even in the same family, people don't speak exactly the same language. So there's always going to be translation. How can we employ XR to help us with the translation from a critical perspective? So I'm actually going to say, Jesse, are you actively here at this particular point? Because I have a question for you. Let's see if she has stepped out for a coffee or if she's here. But she was talking about doing more projects in this community, especially with students. So I was wondering if this might be a time to look a little bit about here. There you are. Hello, Jesse.
Yeah,
Uh,
sorry, it was the network is kind of unstable here.
Great. I'm not the only one. That's good. So these discussions are great, and we will continue them. But I'm wondering, is there anything in the community that you think we should try to make a thing of, and what that might mean?
I think you are the one that I can think of immediately because I personally like your project of the visualization of the concept map. I think I have expressed this interest before, and it's kind of very related to my experience building my own Rome research graph. I think it is something quite interesting. And in terms of because I don't have much VR like this kind of space experience. Although it's not VR, but when I was building my ROM research graph, it's something that you can feel that it drives things in your mind, and it's like a reflection of your mind by sketching a virtual movement thing cognitively, but it's done in a product. So it was the first time that I feel this kind of like thoughts connected, even though it's not a VR experience. But I think this could be better, how to say, like improved in through some VR embedded way to make it more interactivable and also readable. Because now in that product, it's not usable, and it's not you cannot actually make use of that. So I don't know if that makes sense, but this is something that comes to my mind. Is my network okay?
Your network is okay. Audio came through just great.
Oh, okay.
I mean, one thing that might be useful in the community as a project, even if it is not an implementing project, is to decide, first of all, for what purpose do we want to have knowledge? For our future of text work in general this year, for Sloan, we decided that the purpose was to help academics understand how papers connect. That's what we narrowed it
Okay.
down to, at least partly. So I'm wondering, based on what you're saying just there, if we look at specific ideas to share a knowledge map, first of all, to define what we mean by knowledge map and what should be in it, I think that would be tremendously useful because, as Andrea was saying earlier, and I think we all strongly agree with, we all even have very different ideas of what a knowledge map is. So if those who are interested would write a piece on what they mean or sketch it, then we can try to figure out how to interconnect. Fabienne and Andrew and I are working on JSON, maybe Canvas JSON we're looking into, to figure out a way to move stuff about. And it's very simple on surface, and of course it gets extremely tricky with all the realities. But in addition to our general talk, it might be a good grounding system for different aspects of our research. I don't know what you guys all feel on something like that. I mean, let me put it this way as a sales pitch. Knowledge is multidimensional. XR is at minimum four-dimensional, 3D plus time, right? Maybe five-dimensional if you say a dimension is interactivity, just for fun. It's going to become ossified at some point. It's going to become owned by formats somehow. Because if I can't share my knowledge thing with you, it's not communication. Knowledge that can't move is not communication. That's really important. And let's not forget, the internet itself was graduate students, right? We are not all graduate students, but we are a diverse group of people. There's absolutely no reason we cannot invent, implement, use, and spread the beginnings of how multidimensional knowledge can be shared. I really, with all due respect, Brandel, I really don't want Apple or Microsoft or Facebook to own the shape of knowledge. That has to come from us in multiple disagreements of what it even is. Mark is saying, I have doubts. Yeah, absolutely, Mark. Forget my terminology when I say knowledge map. All I mean is, and it's so important, the terminology, and I'll let you speak in a second. I see you're getting ready. All I mean is, at some point, most of us are going to wear headsets or have projectors, and knowledge will be placed in our working environment in 3D. We all agree that's likely to happen for at least part of our working time. So whatever that is called, I called it hyperspace in the paper, and then I decided that was a bit stupid. Whatever that is called, these objects will have a position that will be relative to other objects, to the space that they're in, etc. And this is the thing that I am really concerned will be constrained, because as Jack Park and others are working on, they want to have a Doug Engelbart Cambrian explosion. And the biological Cambrian explosion was a little over 500 million years ago. And we had a PC Cambrian explosion a little under half a century ago. And what happens is, once you have this explosion, it goes quick and then it slows down, if you look at the biological record, right? Same thing is going to happen in XR. Something is going to be the way you position stuff, in the way you encode what the stuff is, how the stuff relates, how it can be interacted with, all of these things. And if that isn't open, then all of our dreaming won't have a place to be. It will literally be the externalized electronic substrate of our thoughts and our knowledge. It's a big deal, guys.
So, Fred, can I just quickly clarify, because I think what I wrote probably was just mistimed with what you were saying, because I wasn't actually making a critique to something you'd said. I was just reflecting on the fact that there's a solecism that crops up a lot in tech, that if you make a graph out of it, somehow it's more meaningful, or it is meaningful of itself, which is just, I think, not true. It can be true, but it is not always true. And that bedevils a lot of systems at the moment, because an awful lot of effort goes into making graphs, whether whether literal or sort of implied. And I think, whereas an area that's sort of subsisted quietly in the weeds since since Doug's time, is spatial hypertext or spatial hypermedia. You can give it whatever you name, where there's a much more sort of plastic interrelation of things. And one of the reasons it works is actually because it's not a graph. Often the links are no more than, actually these things are a bit closer than those, or this is a bit more blue than that. And we cope with that really well, and it makes it easier to use because we're not forced into overly sharp-edged categorizations. And I'll say no more than that, because we're running out of time.
Mark, I'm glad you said that, because that is really, really, really important. Peter, I see your hand, just really briefly. Writing stuff down helps to make it real. All teachers say to the student when they have a great idea, write it down, because a lot of the contradictions and ambiguity goes away, which is great. The other half of that is you have a clarity. Oh, God.
Sorry, Fred, we lost you again.
I'm back, right. So when you write...
2016 cyberspace where I could play with unfolding spaces and have really completely abstract data visualization. But then in the exact opposite direction, since I got the headset, and thank you again, Frode, for dragging me kicking and screaming into getting one. It really has made a huge difference in my ability to think about the entire subject matter. And I had no idea how much different it would be having experienced it versus what I imagined experiencing would be like before I put it on.
I'm
Um,
very
but
happy that you jumped in.
yeah, the other direction is for that realistic environment, even if it's a realistic feeling fictional environment, like the startup environments that we have in the headset for the cyberpunk setting or the Japanese farmhouse environment. And I just sort of like wish that I could combine an external data feed with those environments so that the koi pond activity could be an actual function of what's happening in the real world. Say there's an earthquake somewhere, maybe have the koi fish become more agitated. And that would give me an ambient display while I'm looking at a visualization of some 2D text that I'm reading on a virtual computer monitor inside of the environment. So there's that hyper realistic, but being able to control the environment as a function of some data feeds versus the completely abstract environment of floating around in multidimensional spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. Ambient information and different displays are really, really important. Um, and in closing, please also everyone else feel free to say something in closing. But from my perspective, what I was trying to say earlier was agreeing with Mark that writing stuff down, in a flat graph on paper or in 3D makes more structure than there is. So to find a way to encode fuzziness will be important. We have 2 minutes. What are the final thoughts?
Oh, okay.
I
So
was, go ahead, Jesse.
okay. So I think we can also, because I'm a big fan of collective intelligence, this kind of concept. So I think we can also leverage, since we have the group of amazing people from very different domains and background and, like interest, and we can sort of leverage to a collective intelligence project. Maybe we can keep a track or a record of how we collect perspectives or knowledge from everyone. And I really like what Fraud has said. Knowledge cannot move or share its knowledge itself. Since we are transmitting this knowledge with each other, we can have this kind of experiment within our group and see. Okay, that's my last comments.
Thank you. And Randall? Randall
Um,
thinking.
well, I wasn't sure if it was as truly relevant as I thought. No, I'll say it. I've been reading the first Future textbook over the last couple of weeks as a way to wind down, and but also think about the things that I want to be thinking about. And one of the things that it made me realize is that um, text is the difference between sort of modern hypertext and classical dead tree or worse text and its intertextuality and hypertextuality is really actually only one in degree rather than kind. Everything that's referential has the expectation that people have the ability to kind of either consult it in their little brains or actually pull it out and look at it. And that it's only once we have programs and things that have the sort of material capability to actually change before our eyes that we could have had any expectation that materials could have done anything else. That they've always been cross-referential, um, and that was kind of a deflating to me because it made me realize that while it is an important capability, while the sort of these broader spatial things are novel and they're important insofar as they give rise to new opportunities, it's really more in terms of the mechanical and the facilitation aspect. But the good news is that that gives us a much richer kind of pedigree of thinking to draw on in terms of the referentiality of text. And what are the sort of the necessary costs that would have had to be brought to bear against those sort of making more concrete those capacities for referentiability and stuff like that. So I'm very excited by being able to create spaces, but also being able to think more deeply about what text has always wanted to be, and just sort of give greater voice to those inclinations than would have been not so much impossible, but not economical in the past. So it was a realization about what information in space has been and what we stand to gain by pushing on it a little bit more, but also that to recognize that text itself has always been wanting to push in that direction.
Yeah, thank you, Brandel. And I was going to end really quickly, but I'm not. I'm going to take another few seconds. First of all, Brandel, some of us who are flying over to Washington State for the symposium might come via California. If you have someone really cool to introduce us to, please do that so we can plan. We would love to. At least Mark and Fabienne from Europe, Carl and Chris, I hope, will be coming from America land. First thing. Second thing is.
Sorry, a little dump there on the text.
Oh. So, right. So the other thing is, oh my God, again. Oh, okay. That's that. Okay, you're back. So, please, based on Jesse's enthusiasm here, youthful student enthusiasm, please write stuff down. I keep saying it to the community, but that is whether you give me a PDF, an HTML link, or whatever it is, it's so great to be able to have a fully formed thought, even if it's just a paragraph that's not on Twitter or Slack. And then what we will do later is put it into the book. Because the dream of the future of text is partly to be able to cite other articles in the future of text, right? It would be amazing for me to read an article in the future of text that says, this one on the other page is absolutely rubbish. Let me tell you why. That's a dialogue, and that's for the future, right? Of course, we're going to try to do an XR implementation of the book this year, or at least next year. But part of the idea is to have some kind of a student in 500 years' time thumbing through a paper version of the book and being inspired, right? This is not a just for now project. So that's that. And then really briefly also, we've started experimenting with notions of how to freeze text and how to have it interactive forever. And this is just a little comment to what Brandel was talking about. One of the ways I'm looking at is having the full markdown version. Oh, God.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I'm just going to say thank you all.
Well, 1 second, I'm typing in the chat.
Such an expensive discussion on these things.
Okay, so it just remains to say thank you and goodbye for today.
Yep, great session.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it so much. We'll continue this on Monday. If you can, if you can be there, great. If not, we'll see what happens in the future. And yes, I will. I see some requests here for the record. Yes, I will share it. All right. See you all. Thank you again. Bye.